Happy Monday. How's it going, everybody?
It's going well. Welcome back, Joe, to the United
Thank you.
States.
Yes, I am very exhausted right now. So it's funny because jet lag. I'm sure Neelesh, you can attest to this, right? We were talking about this before the show, but if you travel by yourself overseas, I think it's hard enough with jet lag. But then you have a family that you that also travels with you, and it's comical. Everyone's waking each other up at any godforsaken hour of the morning, so it's pretty hilarious. So.
Yeah, I'm familiar with jet lag pretty much.
Yeah, it sounds like it. You go to India quite a bit, so that is a long travel. So
that's about as bad as it gets in terms of jet lag, right? I'm trying to remember. Is it Salt Lake to Mumbai is like a 12-hour difference or something like that? So from Pacific time, it's like 13 hours or okay.
Yeah, 13.5, and it switches daylight savings or not. So
then you got that odd like half-hour increment thing in some areas too.
Yeah,
and so
1.5 versus it's 5:30 GMT plus 5:30. So it's like it's weird.
We'll talk about timestamps in a bit here. So anyway, yeah.
So it's every data engineer's favorite topic.
Yes,
of course.
Awesome. For people who don't know who you are, do you want to give a quick intro about yourself?
Sure. I'm Neelesh. Currently, I'm a staff software engineer at DBT, and my background has mostly been in data systems, data infrastructure, distributed systems, and excited to be talking to you guys.
Likewise.
Yeah. Thanks for taking the time to join. Yeah, we're excited about this.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
And Matt, I'll let you lead most of the conversation because my brain is operating at like 50% capacity right now. So it's I feel like a barely charged iPhone. So
like 1% low power mode, basically.
Yeah, like it's about to shut off. So
okay. Well, jump in anytime. I mean, maybe
sure.
jet lag can also lead to creativity. So
that's real crazy questions about to come out. So
yeah, exactly. It's gonna get real wild here.
Yeah.
So I mean, as I was reading your bio, Neelesh, one thing that stood out to me is that you kind of straddled this transition from the big data era, so things like Yarn and Hadoop, into the what we'll call the more modern cloud-oriented era of data. What was it like just kind of cutting your teeth on the big data systems and everything else, working on like the guts of Yarn and other systems?
It was a different ballgame for sure. Back then, systems were less mature, and I'm talking way back from my Cloudera days, which was like 2014 to early 2017. A lot of customers had the need for data, had like the urge to build different systems that would empower them, but there was somewhat of a lack of knowledge, a lack of maturity in these systems. So it took a lot of effort to build and stabilize these platforms. I know at Cloudera, we did a lot to support our customers in every way possible, make sure they're successful. And that taught us a lot of lessons at scale, a lot of things that would break, random things that would happen. So, and if you host that many services, especially that Cloudera did, it was a lot of work. It was a lot of helping. It was a lot of like maintenance work, operations work, so very heavy. And my job there was pretty much associated with the customer, with the large customer, and just help them be successful in general. So which would end up being making sure their pipelines run correctly, their systems are in check. We used to have like regular check-ins and make sure any kind of issues creep up would get solved. And so it's a very like close relationship with customers that they had. And that the only thing I can just like sort of highlight from that era has been the setup, the ecosystem, the effort it takes to make these things successful is large. There's a large time and resource intensive investment that you have to put in to get successful. And so that's what it takes. At a smaller scale, it wouldn't matter. And when you go complexity, you add more people in your team, you add more use cases, your business grows to maybe different emerging markets, let's say, or different international zones. You're adding more complexity into that existing business. And so it's not just a scale problem at that point of time, it becomes a more operational heavy problem. And so that's the one sort of takeaway I have from that it's just hard. It just takes a lot of time and effort to build a successful sort of working ecosystem in that case.
Yeah, I feel like the sales pitch from that era was a bit misleading. I mean, certainly a lot of companies got a lot of value out of big data, but the sales pitch was, hey, you can scale your data up to petabytes and it's going to be cheap because you're just going to do it on commodity hardware. And that this factor of like massive operational overhead kind of got swept under the rug sometimes until people actually set up these systems. Like, whoa, we're spending, you know, millions of dollars a year just running these systems on the team to run them. Like, that's our biggest cost by far.
That is true. And I'm sort of seeing that coming into discussions these days. Like, people are questioning whether cloud is the right alternative for them, or like go back to their own data centers. So it's always a cost question when it comes to selling these internally as well. Like CIOs, CDOs would not sign off if they don't know, hey, what are we spending on this? What is the actual expenditure we need to host this thing? That's where sort of the importance of the solution and how complex and easy it is to set up comes in play. And then, can you monitor as well? Can you monitor the cost? Can you make sure that you are aware of how things are growing? And that kind of, like, I felt the pain on the other side when I went to Stitch Fix, because we had to build everything on our own. So it was more of a build rather than a buy in that case. So I can adhere to the pain because I felt it.
It feels like the notion of FinOps is really in the air for data right now. I encountered that from one of Joe and I's good friends as we were writing our book. We thought a lot about like cost optimization for data. I hadn't heard the term FinOps until around then, when it started to kind of bubble up in the cloud arena. And then it's like, oh yeah, this is the perfect concept we need for data as well, because data does cost money. It's not just that you can run a huge query or store massive amounts of data. Like, you're going to pay for it either in operational complexity or in cloud costs, or both potentially. Sorry, Joe. It looked like you had something
and data also makes money too, right? I think that's the other side of the equation. And I think all too often the cost question is interesting. I find like it seems to be a moving target depending, I guess, on external variables, like how much money is floating in the economy at 0% interest rates, and like how much can you get away with on somebody else's dime now that the things have kind of changed, and now that you might be operating on your dime. You're going to be paying a lot more attention to, I think, both the revenue and the cost sides of the equation. But what's really interesting too, is I think, Matt, we discussed this a bit, where some companies we've seen, they're one of their metrics is EBITDA, for example. We came across a client where they intentionally wanted to use on-prem so they could depreciate the capital expenditure over a period of time, which made their EBITDA number look better versus like front loading all the expense up front on the P&L. And so that was a interesting accounting tactic, because they were also complaining that, we can't really move flexibly because all of our data center is sort of locked up for like the next few years. And so we can't really move agilely if we wanted to. So I thought it was a interesting trade-off. But you're certainly right, Neelesh. Sort of the conversation is definitely like a pendulum almost, right? It's moving back towards, do we need the cloud, or or what's a good alternative? So it's interesting.
And there's no right answer, to my opinion. There's like whatever you or your company needs. So that, like, can you scale it? Does it make sense financially and like, does the setup take much time? It's all a sort of intermixing of different variables of, does it scale well? Does it handily load? Can you manage it? Is it cost effective? So whatever matrix that forms is whatever works for your company. And there's no right answer. Like Google and Facebook use their own data centers. They're operating at a web scale. Something like Apple or someone would go into the cloud or data center. It depends on their use cases and their business needs at that hour. And then then it all comes down to cost and how much you can stare at the cost explorer in AWS and tell who used the C9 large in your company.
For sure. That brings up an interesting point, though, too, because it's something that I keep seeing in these articles, about maybe cloud repatriation arguments. That if you kind of dig underneath the argument that we need to assess how we're doing things, the doing things part's fascinating, because a lot of it, I think, from what I've read, comes back to maybe a misunderstanding or a knowledge gap in terms of how to operate in the cloud most effectively. So a common symptom of this is treating the cloud like your on-prem system, and then just lifting and shifting your services over. Like, I don't think Matt or I would ever advise you do that exactly, unless there was a good reason for it, because it's actually going to cost you more money probably. So
Unless you have a cliff where it's like, I have to get out
Mhm.
of my data centers by this date because there's a huge expenditure on the line, right? I have to renew my lease for 3 years, or I have to sign a new contract, and I've got to get out now. The problem is we see companies like Lyft and Shift, just all their old stuff that's very expensive to run on the cloud, and then not make that next step, which is really tough. And I imagine working at Cloudera, you probably saw this sometimes too, where it's like, all right, we're going to these new technologies, but oh wait, we're kind of stuck halfway in between.
Yeah, and Cloudera was mostly on-prem back then.
Yep.
They sort of tried to make a cloud play. I don't know where they're at at this point, but it was all customers who were on-prem and large, like Fortune 500 businesses, banks, whatever. And they were slow in not just like adoption, but also development. So if anything things get updated, there's a cycle that it goes through within in terms of compliance, in terms of verification, in terms of making sure everything is aligned within their sub team. So an upgrade would take that much longer, depending the complexity and how much of a breaking change or any kind of changes we make. So we've observed that, at least back then, it was hard to do upgrades. It was hard to do any kind of changes pretty quickly, and the movement is very restricted to the organization itself and how it functions as a unit.
What are some of the bigger changes you've seen, maybe since, from when you got into, building data infrastructure to today?
I don't know. I think it becomes more easier with managed solutions. Like we had to build, like in Stitch Fix, I can attest to this experience because we didn't rely on a lot of external vendors. Our major vendor was AWS, and everything was essentially hand built. And the background to this is because our leadership team came from Netflix, who essentially followed the same principle, which was building everything on their own. They were the first customers of AWS, so they had a large expertise of how to build things successfully. And so a lot of my colleagues built tooling that would just instantly deploy a service. It had like metrics across the board. There was a sort of we had this open source. Now it's open source. It's called Flotilla, which was essentially an abstracted execution framework over ECS, and that got moved to Kubernetes later on. But that was there in 2017 when I showed up. So it was already there, and it was made to be engineers were made to be successful because there was underlying infrastructure to allow them to. And so that is important to have as a company before you think of venturing out and making your team successful. The tooling is important. The baseline architecture is important. And so with that, we still had difficulties. We still had like scaling things, complexity things. Like Spark is a whole mess I can talk about like 15, 20 minutes. But the thing that became, to answer your question, like things that became easier over the years is, can we build the right thing that gives the right value for the people and like for the users in this case, and our customers were internal. So the more we could abstract and hide away the cruft behind the scenes, that like sort of helped us build better solutions. There was a tight feedback loop between our data scientists who are our users. And so all of that helped us improve the existing architecture. We did larger migrations as well, changed tooling. But over the years, it became easier because we had some of the baseline architecture already defined. And so building on top of that, we just made sure that we built the right thing at a certain point. We deduped a lot of the tools. So I speak about this a little bit in my like LinkedIn post, but in general, it's been an incremental change over the years that's been better and like sort of more mindful rather than just like, hey, let's just build this. If we need it, we'll use it, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, Joe and I have consulted with a number of startups, and we've seen this again and again, where I would argue they get way into trying to build their own platforms. There are kind of two reasons for this to what you were saying, Neelesh, which is they see Google and they're like, oh, Google did this and they were super successful. Or they came from another startup. Maybe they started a startup and they're like, oh, we built everything from scratch. It's like, yeah, but the world has changed. When Google was doing this from the get-go, this stuff didn't exist, and now it does. And you're way too small to be building all this stuff from scratch. What we argue when we come and consult with startups is like, find the thing that's really unique to you, that's your secret sauce, and work on that. But otherwise, use managed services until you grow up. When you grow up, then you can think about customizing and doing stuff from scratch. But like, there's so much labor involved in doing custom tooling and a custom platform. if you're a 10-person startup. It just doesn't make a lot of sense.
And it also ties back to the FinOps aspect. Like, how much are you ready to spend on your infrastructure? Like, we had our warehouse on, don't mind me saying this, but S3. Like, everything was in S3 and everything was built around it. That's not conventional, but it worked.
Right.
It took a lot of effort around to build the ecosystem to make it successful. That's where the sort of difficulty came in. Like, I wouldn't do that today, but what I had to live with what we had, and it worked because we put in the effort of building the whole ecosystem around.
But that was
it.
back in
Wouldn't work
2017, though, right? Around that,
Yeah,
that era. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, that was a different time too.
It was.
It really was.
And I
Yeah, the
can
world has
attest,
changed.
yes. Yeah, yeah, I wouldn't do it today, definitely. But it's all about, if you're bootstrapping, if you're starting a company, you would do the first thing that comes to your mind rather than just like, oh, I'm going to scale for the 10,000 queries per second versus like you're running like 100 queries or less than that for. So it's all dependent on where your business is at, and you can reevaluate years later. But that comes in the question of like, do you have technical debt? Can you do migrations easily? That kind of thing occurs later on. But at the first go, I wouldn't complex it as much as needed.
Kind of a related question to George Farrakhan asks, as things changed a lot in the past 2 years, what's the most difficult thing now in setting up that infrastructure? I'm assuming he's referring to.
I think it's one thing about like the modern data stack is that it brings a lot of tooling to the mix. Like, what things work for different purposes. Like great expectations is there for data quality. We had to build data quality on our own. Like, I know Avgon personally, but I love the tooling, but we didn't have the luxury to just integrate something. That was the hard part. Can we just take this and jam it in our infrastructure? The integration cost was higher. So we just built it around the custom use cases, and then it became a lot of customization. So one of the most difficult things today, I think there are a lot of toolings that make it easier today than in the past 2 years, in the past actually. But it all depends on what you're trying to build. The easiness comes from like, do you start small and go forward, or do you just build for the larger use cases? And I think the difficult part comes when your team doesn't have expertise, doesn't have that much insight into what might happen a year later. So there's a lot of like baseline decisions that will go into building a data infrastructure today that if you don't have the expertise or don't have the insight, it might come and bite you a year later. So it's important to set up that good baseline as well.
How do you advise startup founders to address that problem? Like, how should they, I don't know, where should they look for advice to make good early decisions on their platform so that they don't get bit a year later? I mean, obviously you can't avoid every possible problem, but like, where would you go for advice?
I would see, most of these questions come when like you need data in your business. There's some companies that operate with very minimal data infrastructure and don't need it for the longest time. Yes, they lose out on insights, but at some point in time, they're not investing on something they don't need. So when they do try to invest or start thinking along these lines, they're making a conscientious decision that I need data to power my business. So I need data to get more insights into the business. And that's where the actual purpose of that data infrastructure comes in. Like, what are you building for? Are you building, who's your first data hire? Like, who are you bringing into the mix first to make these data decisions if you don't have expertise in-house? And how do you get that person successful? How do you get that person started? What is that person first working on? Are they working on building insights into data, collecting data, cleaning up? Usually the first data engineer is going to do that. It's going to take in the first crappy data or whatever you have and clean it up and make it more insightful. So essentially the story. And so that part is the first step in my understanding. And so I would understand is, what is the first use case you're trying to tackle with data, and then go from there, because that's the reason you would build a data team, and getting that data team successful is onto you. Like, it's up to you to get them the tooling, get them every kind of recruitment and like hiring done in that team to make them successful over the years. But be mindful of what that is powering the business. Is it helping the bottom line, or is it just adding a cost that just like doesn't have a definition? Like, okay, it's not helping in any actual business decision making.
Got a question here from YouTube from John O'Gorman. He asks, are size, complexity, and app centricity of data directly related to the cost and complexity of infrastructure? Second part question is, would a data-centric architecture reduce the cost and complexity of infrastructure?
This is sort of thinking around the lines of like keeping those separate, and ideally there should be some level of separation. The cost, the size and complexity do add a lot of the cost. Like you would not be processing terabytes of data if your business doesn't generate that much data. It comes from the business and the actual use cases that you're powering. And so it definitely adds to the cost. And that's where you have to be mindful. Like you have that much data coming in, or you have to process that much data, there's that much complexity. That will add to the cost and complexity of your infrastructure for sure, because you're building, not just adding more machines, but you're adding more complex frameworks, you're adding more complex tooling to deal with. That takes not just infrastructure costs, but like people costs. It takes time, it takes effort, it takes resources. And to answer the second part, with the data-centric architecture reduce the complexity, I don't know if it would reduce as such. I'm trying to think of how to answer that, because
I guess, what is a data-centric architecture?
That's what
right. So I have a book in the mail actually from Dave McComb, who wrote a book called is it The Data-Centric Revolution, I think. So I'm very interested to see what his take is on this. I just finished his last book, Software Wasteland, which is like one of the best books I've ever read on IT, by the way. Hidden gem. He just talks about how everything is mismanaged and it's in software. But it's an interesting point, because again, I'm not sure what a data-centric architecture means in this context. I mean, you could make an argument in some respects that every company is a data company, therefore every architecture is data-centric or something along those lines. But it's also, I think, a bit of a red herring, or it might be an interesting one. And at the same time, too, the size, complexity, and app centricity of data is an interesting thread. I'm not sure if you read the Big Data is Dead article from Jordan Tigani that came out, where he had some very revealing information where even though BigQuery was housing a lot of data for customers, the amount of data that they would query at any given time was a percentile of the overall data sizes. So again, it's like, what do you need versus what are you doing with it? I think it's an important thing to ask. So.
And Neelesh, I love how you're talking a lot about the cost of complexity, because I see all the time these like Medium posts coming out of places like LinkedIn where people talk about here's our awesome architecture. Look at how amazing this is. Everyone should be doing this. And rarely do engineers mention the costs, neither the hardware costs nor especially the human and operational costs of these infrastructures.
That's centered to my experience, because I was doing a migration back in 2018, and my VP would just show up at my desk with a laptop and like, hey, dude, we're spending a lot on this cluster. Can you? And so I had to autoscale that more manually, but I had to be actually vigilant about costs while doing large things. And it's usually budgetary. It's usually things that are like very aligned with the company's spending and goals that it needs to. But yes, if it's driving value, you have to still be mindful of costs as you do valuable things. I can get to that around like even why we moved to Iceberg and like Spark costs and that kind of thing. But it's around just being mindful, actually, to make sure that your infrastructure, like we had to reserve spot instances from AWS at a cheaper rate. We ran spot instances on task nodes. And the trick there is to price it that you would pay. Like you can tell them, I'm going to pay as much as the on-demand cost, and you'll somewhat be reliably delivered an AWS instance for sure. I don't know how often we've lost the bids, but I think putting it in on-demand pricing, which is the max, will somewhat give you a spot instance, regardless of when you request for it.
Interesting.
I'm going to put up Davis's question. Oh, yeah. I'm going to put up Davis's question, Joe, about hiring an early data engineer, and then I'm going to, I'll let you answer it in English, but so it's basically, talking about your insight about like really when you're in the early days of a startup, it's really critical to just make this first hire. And so for our podcast listeners, his question is, what is more important for first data engineer at a startup? No specific objective to make this easier. Focusing on data culture and long-term strategy, shipping products quickly, or planning architecture infrastructure?
I'm going to give a boring answer. It depends. It's more like I alluded to earlier. It's more use case driven. Like that first data engineer is not necessarily going to look long term. They can be hired for, oh, we need this to improve in the next 6 months. So they're laser focused on getting something delivered the next 6 months, or they're hired enough to ramp up a team, bring in a team for like, okay, we need to invest in data over the next 2 years. So this person will come in, set up the team, look at the tooling, talk to the customers, talk to the people inside the team to understand where the need of data is coming from. Like, what are we powering here? Like I mentioned earlier, and so it kind of depends on what that data engineer is being hired to solve. So if it's products shipping quickly, what does that mean on the data side? Like, how much data would that generate? How much would that hurt the business on having a messy data infrastructure at this point?
Mhm.
So it could be anywhere from like cleanup from existing stuff, setting up like a baseline architecture. Like they could come in and just like set up a data warehouse and clean things. That's the bare minimum they could do in my regard. And then that could set up for like, okay, we'll add more tooling, we'll get business insights, we'll add BI, we'll add all of these other things. But I think the first few things are mostly cleanup related, or at least in a beginning startup, unless they've like very mindfully thought of data as a first class citizen. I think it ends up being mostly cleanup and just bringing it into a sort of kosher state, if you will, for the data in the company.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. It also seems like I think another lens to look at this question through is like what type of startup is this? I could make a pretty strong argument that the startups of 2023 are not the same as the startups of 2021. These they're different companies born of different times and under different circumstances and different expectations on them, right? So for if you've been hired as a data engineer, what are you expected to do? What's your job? So and also I would probably ask the question, what does a board expect from data, right? I mean,
yes,
ultimately what you're seeing is a lot of startups are facing the cold reality that the board's in control at the end of the day, not your boss, not your boss's boss, but the boss's 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 boss is the one who ultimately has a say in kind of how things are going to go. So I would definitely focus on understanding what that is. What's the top level consideration, because it's, as an engineer, it's really easy to get caught up in the day-to-day of your job, which you should do. That's what you got hired to do. But I think you also need to kind of figure out true north for the company is where. Well, hopefully it's north, but what does that look like? And hope try and go that direction. I think that's because again, the word startup is a pretty loaded word actually right now, and I could say that it's not the same as it was back in the day. So actually, Mohammed has a question kind of back related to a thread we were talking about a few minutes ago. He says he sees more startups bringing on analysts and think they can handle all the complexity for data infrastructure. This is kind of related to this other question. What advice would you give to these kinds of startups? And what is the modern data stack you'd recommend for early stage startups?
That's interesting. I think they're coming from the experience of like maybe analysts are already empowered with like infrastructure that is capable to get them successful, and that's a luxury in my land. When I came from, like we had to build these tooling and make them successful. We didn't have almost a data engineering team, so if tooling can make it easier for somebody to just come in and like handle it, that's really good tooling, if you will. It's kind of like, but then setup, like how do you actually understand whether that setup is right, is a decision you will understand maybe a couple of years down the line. When you hit problems of scale, you'll hit problems of complexity. So I wouldn't much like wonder about tooling which is right at the beginning, because you're growing your startup, you're understanding what you can learn. There's like if you can't go wrong if you're building like a large data warehouse and just like getting data and deriving insights with like BI, like very simple, bare minimum use cases. You can't go wrong much in that, unless you want some really esoteric things that are way to start. But if you start very small, or like even in some of these like bare bones things, I think you can go wrong, but you will hit maybe a complexity time a year later, a couple of years later, where your use case is evolving. Some things are not easily upgradable. Some things are hurting you. It takes time. It's slow. All of those kind of problems will emerge later on. So I don't think a particular tooling would be advisable to like, hey, I'm going to pick this particular one when I start my startup or when I start my business. It might work out. It might always be the right choice for you. You may never need to migrate things, but in reality, that might not end up happening. In practice, it can be limited to your experience. It can be limited to your use cases, and you might have to evolve your architecture as you go forward. And that's totally fine. Companies go through evolution. Uber went through a ton of evolution as they scaled the data infrastructure. They went through hell. Like they had to optimize for HDFS and things. So every company evolves. It's fine. It's totally fine. But when you start, don't waste a lot of time. Just think what's important for your business and just start with the bare minimum tool that gets you there. And then you can always evolve that.
Mm-hmm. And in fact, if you're lucky enough to succeed in having scaling issues, I would say you should go throw a party. So like,
true enough, yeah,
it's like you hit puberty or something, as a teenager. It's like, so you're growing up. So a lot of companies don't get to that stage though. A lot of them sort of just die on the way to the beach, so to speak, and that's how it is. So
yeah, it's unfortunate. Yeah, I mean, it depends. The market is brutal. Like people are very mindful of what they need and what kind of tooling they need. If it's a SaaS company, or people are very informed these days. I think consumers are informed, users are informed, businesses are informed. They know whether to pick one tool versus the other. Like I remember doing a POC between Delta, Hoodie, and Iceberg. I had to be mindful of what choice matters for the company. Yeah. Versus like, oh, I'm just going to pick the latest and greatest or the most shiniest thing and just work with it. You have to be mindful. So you have to go down the route that essentially makes sense for your team. And so I think that in one way, it's good for the consumer, for the user. But as a business, you have to adhere to their needs, and you have to make sure your business aligns with their thoughts and their essentially their needs.
Totally agree. One tool I'll throw out there too, which I would say is, I'm probably gonna get lots of hate mail for this, but start with spreadsheets. You don't have a lot of data anyway, typically. So, I mean, use something that's pretty much free, easy to understand, and is pretty low impact. So it can get you the answers you need. So
well, and hopefully easy to migrate away from when you need to. When you get into really complex infrastructure, the migrations become more complicated.
But you'll know the feedback loop would be really, really quick, because you'll know really quick if you've outgrown a spreadsheet. In which case, again, congratulations. But I think a lot of these are overlooked. Like I think everyone wants to jump into always try to get the Snowflake, BigQuery, Redshift, or whatever, and out of the gate. And we're talking like usually very minuscule data sizes, where I don't know that you need a column store data warehouse to query this data. It just isn't necessary. So
yeah, mostly you're looking at yesterday's data, or like how things performed yesterday. That's it. Like,
bingo.
One of the big use cases we had in Stitch Fix was our teams used to ingest data at midnight from our engineering teams, which was on more front-facing mobile apps, web, and just derive insights the next day. So what happened yesterday was today's analytics. So we would just query yesterday's data and make sure the tests are running and analysis is performed, whatever, and different like business decisions are made accordingly. And so we optimize for that sometimes. There's historical tables that we had for storing things that were like 6 years old, but nobody would query all of that at once unless you're changing, doing backfilling, those kinds of things. So the need was very immediate, or very like the time resolution was very low, like maybe a day or a couple of days worth of data would be the max that you would pull in at most of the cases. So if 80% is just going to do that, you might as well solve for that and let the 20% be the latter.
Yeah, that's such a good point too, because it's about getting into the habit of answering questions and asking questions too with data. I think that's super critical, because again, we can talk about tools all day, but it's getting the company in the habit of using data to make decisions. I think is kind of sort of the crux. If that happens, then kind of everything else falls into place, right? Then you're off to the races. But if you've set up this data stack and nobody cares and nobody's asking questions of it, I think you got bigger problems in your hand, like looking for a new job pretty soon. And so
it's the basic business processes, human processes, Joe, and then eventually wrapping those in infrastructure once it makes sense to do so.
That's a rubric I always look at things through. I mean, because I've been the guy who's been totally tech first and diving into it, and math first and everything, and I've seen where that's gone, and I don't know. So learn the hard way.
Something just came to my head that like it's also a cultural thing, like a data culture within the company. It's not necessarily ingrained in the culture from the beginning. Like founders would have a different mindset as they build, as they've seen problems while they bootstrap, they've seen different issues. So data has never come up as maybe a thing that they would consider. So it's a cultural change to build in within a team that says, okay, we're going to think about data more succinctly, more mindfully, that will actually be impactful for the business. And that's somewhat of a cultural shift, but because you're thinking differently, you're using what you have, you might add more, you add more people to your business who are thinking along those lines. So you'll see that change happen culturally in your team and in your company as you sort of put in that investment for the company. It's not going to be a day, it's going to be years worth of things. Like Netflix, Apple, Stripe, these guys didn't come up overnight. They took a long time to build infrastructure, data infrastructure. And there's those sharpening tools within them. So it's not going to be just like build it and go. It's going to be building and improving, optimizing it, all that kind of thing.
Yeah. Right. Look,
I want to back up. I want to rewind slightly on one question here. So I love, Neelesh, how you talk about early stage startups. Instead of the founders thinking in terms of technical decisions, think in terms of people, think in terms of who your first data engineering hire is, who that founding engineer is. So for you, what's your hiring strategy, whether you're hiring a CTO, founding engineer, staff engineer, like how do you go about that? Because I feel like in Silicon Valley, this is still considered an unsolved problem. We have like conventions, whiteboard interviews and things, but it's not clear that that actually does a good job of hiring good people for these different jobs.
I think I can simplify hiring into two metrics. One is aptitude and cultural fit. So aptitude would be, are they technically capable? Are they capable to do the job that they're needed to? Like, what is the role demanding, the expectation set? Can they meet that expectations at a certain level? Because as you grow, we can talk about like scope and things around staff and like whatever levels. But at a certain level, if you're expecting the person to perform, can they perform at that level? And you test them with the signals that they need to get out of those interviews, whether they can handle questions at that scale and that scope. And then that's how you hire higher level engineers. Junior level engineers, you have some level of leeway because you're testing for very small things, very like limited things that you don't care about, that are like unbounded scope and all ambiguity. You don't have to test a lot of that, so it's relatively easier. But the higher you go, your complexity and your demand for that role or your expectations for that role increases. And so that's one, the aptitude portion covers that. And the culture fit it's very nuanced. Every company has its own culture. It has its own like sort of things, how they like it. I won't take names, but a lot of companies have their own very esoteric culture. Like, hey, we're not this way. We're not this way. That's fine. That whatever works for you, but make sure that the person aligns with your culture, or like make sure that the person matches the value set. Like one nice thing about DBT, like we had values written on day one. Like Tristan put up values of the company, and when I spoke to him first time, he was like, "Hey, here are our values." I'm like, "Yeah, that makes sense," because I came from another company that sort of had the same values, and that's like a harder thing to test for. Essentially, it's hard to say whether a person would not be a good fit or would be a good fit based on just like cultural or behavioral questions, but it boils down to just being a decent person and somebody who you can work with in a team, and it's just not a bad person, or like somebody you can work with very easily. That essentially boils down to that. So there's no like too much complexity there. But yeah, aptitude and culture fit is the two things I would look for in a person.
If you were to pick one, Which one would you pick?
In what way?
If you're hiring somebody,
You can pretty much get a read for cultural fit. I think so. Aptitude would
yeah.
be mainly because because the role is technically demanding. It's you're actually looking for skills that are maybe specialized, maybe generalist. It depends on the role again, but I would weigh aptitude heavier. But yes, you still want to work with a person. If they're not a cultural fit,
Right.
it will hit your company in another 3 months. You're like, oh wait, this person was a bad hire. So that's also something you have to be mindful for.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, hiring's hard too. I mean, it's I think on a good day it's as good as a coin flip. So it's just it's tricky. So yeah, I definitely like that. That's a good rubric. Keep that in mind. I guess kind of zooming out for the next maybe 2-3 years. Like, where do you see data infrastructure going?
That's a good question. I haven't thought that far because there's so much development happening. There's so many new tooling coming in. It all, I think, depends on how much companies are data aware and want to use data for their business. I think I'm just going to repeat myself, but essentially it's, will use cases expand, or will it be the same, or will there be changes in how people deal with data and deal with data infrastructure? Like, we're talking about big data is dead. I've been hearing that for a while, but like, it takes time to adopt. Adoption takes a long time. Practices, patterns change very slowly within companies. Like, the bleeding edge companies will adapt tomorrow. Maybe in a few months, they have processes like, oh, we're shifting one full org into thinking this way, or like we're doing it this way. But not every org might adapt immediately. Not every company might adapt. So it takes time for these things to evolve. It takes time for patterns to emerge, patterns to get adopted within companies. And so I think we might see, like when I attended Data AI Summit, I saw somewhat of a shift coming from that big data era into the sort of, I wrote about this separately, but it's about like thinking about it differently and saying, hey, can I use this modern data stack, or like whatever the tooling that is coming in this sort of new suite of things? Can I use it in this older architecture? And versus there are some who came up to me and the folks at DBT were like, we don't even have a data strategy. We're like now thinking about it. Where do I go? So it's anywhere between where do I go for my existing architecture versus where do I go from zero? Yeah. So it all depends on how you're thinking about this. What are your use cases? Where are you going in the next 2-3 years? Do you optimize for the business? Do you optimize for just like, okay, we'll see where this goes. If you have that much bandwidth to risk around it, that's fine. But if you want to derive actual insights and make it valuable, you have to be a bit more mindful of, okay, I'm going to follow this pattern. I'm going to make these hiring decisions. I'm going to make these kind of decisions based on the data, which will help like ad revenue, marketing, finance. I will have different business verticals depending on it. That's where you actually build, and your patterns emerge from there. So it's kind of deriving again from the business model and the sort of core domain that you're tackling. So it's all subjective to where the company is moving and how you want to think about data in that regard.
How should engineers communicate with business stakeholders about data value? How should they explain the value that they do provide, and maybe more importantly, the value that they can potentially provide in collaboration with the business?
I think stakeholders have expectations around what can data help me do better, or not necessarily better, or like different. So what is that metric? Is it trackable? Is it something that we can measure? So if we want to measure for, at the top of my head, like user growth or user adoption in some product, how do you measure that? How do you effectively measure that and collect the data and make sure you have the right tooling and insights to derive that metric? And that comes from some trial and error. There's not going to be a perfection if you're not doing it from the start. We don't have things already set up for that. You're going to do some initial analysis. You're going to do some POC work. You're going to test out things. And as you communicate as a data, I'm thinking myself as a data engineer, I would talk about what are we powering, what are we actually gathering, and throw out even a tiny POC. Go with the basic thing that you can implement and show, okay, here's the value. It might not be accurate at this point. This is what I'm trying to show you. is where we can derive insights from. Let's run this experiment for like a week and see how we can generate insights, and does it match up with the real world? Because data is, for some reason, it can be deterministic, it cannot be also. There might be factors that you're missing out. There might be aspects or attributes that are missing out. So it may not be a clean solution that will map the real world, but if you do enough experimentation, if you do a lot of like testing, you will find out those aspects that you're missing, and you go ahead and change those things. And then that relation you have with the stakeholder is going to strengthen based on how much you can deliver and how deeply you understand their core problem and solve for that. So it's all about understanding the pain and solving for the pain, but the methodology is different depending on what you're trying to strive for. If you're getting some metric out of the real world business, how do you model that? How do you actually generate the right insights? Do you get the right inputs for that? Those all come from rigorous experimentation, very thoughtful thinking around that particular use cases. So it's a slow thing. It's not going to be immediate. I would say, be patient, be communicative, set expectations correctly with your stakeholders. Tell them, hey, this is not looking right. I'm going to change the whole thing over the weekend and just like rewrite it and see what works. So that's fine. As long as you can set those expectations, that's great, so that they're mindful. And then over a while, like I don't know what the timeline and estimation you would give for these things, but I would add buffer time for things that could go wrong. So just to make sure that they're understanding, hey, I may be stuck on something. So it's all about there's a finesse to doing this, and it doesn't come straightforwardly. It takes time to develop this sort of relation with the stakeholders, and how do you deliver for them. So I think, that's in a nutshell. Like it's going to take a slow, very conscientious effort to get there over time.
Well, Joe, you were recently reading a book called Data and Reality, right? That's very much connected with this question of the the fact that data is supposed to represent what's actually happening on the ground, whether in a warehouse or with your employees or whatnot.
Yeah, it was for anybody out there, if you wanted an interesting read, Data and Reality by William Kent, written in 1978. But the notion was really, there's information, there's knowledge, and data, and so how do you represent, reality in a computer system? This was still, it was a big question back then. I would still say it's a question that pops up once in a while, especially in data modeling conversations. But yeah, it's an interesting one, and the thing is, you'll never get it right. At best you're going to come up with somewhat of an approximate abstraction of this, but it's a central theme to, I would say, everything that we do as a business or as an industry, because at the end of the day, you're trying to capture things that are generated throughout the normal course of a business, or data that might relate to it through third parties and so forth, and assemble it in such a way that you can get a picture of your business. And then it's interesting too. And I was hanging out with Bill, him in was it last month or the month before, but he's walking me through his view of data. And structured data is very interesting, where that's data that's very much has an internal application for BI, and that's historically how it's been used. Whereas text is the text data, which he's been focusing on, is really that's stuff that's external to the world, really. So that's like customer reviews and stuff, really. So it's also understanding like where's the data coming from and what's the purpose of it, and how do you want to use it. So, but none of this stuff exists in a vacuum. At the end of the day, I think, to your point, Neelesh, you really need to take the data that's been collected so far, and I think assess whether or not it's useful to answer the questions that people want to have answered. But this again it's an incremental thing, and the thing is, data is always a moving target, because reality is a moving target. If everything was static, then what would you need to do? Your job is very simple. So, but these are complex problems precisely because the world is a very dynamic, complex system. If you can even call it a system,
Let me ask a follow-up question related. Oh, go ahead.
No, some call it the Matrix, but I don't know.
Yeah, it's all a simulation anyway, right? Yeah. This is my follow-up question, though, related to what Joe was mentioning just now about text. You Neelesh, have worked on, you worked on Hadoop, you worked at Cloudera. Back then, we were very interested in text, like text processing using tools like Pig. Fast forward to 2023, now we have tools like ChatGPT. But I think text is still a hard problem. What are your just general thoughts about text processing in this era? How should we think about text as data professionals?
That's an interesting thing. We had we used to store a lot of data, at least in Stitch Fix, like we used to store some data into text input format, and that moved over to CSV, more structured, then moved to Parquet. So I've seen that evolution happen, and I think, to the point earlier that you mentioned, can you model that? Can you model that text or make it meaningful? Not just a blob of text, but like something that is like, okay, this is the field that this text is associated with or very relatable to. So can you model that in a way that is structured, that you can ingest and say, okay, I know what somebody replied on a order chat form something. So I have that detailed and I have that structured enough that I can ingest it and make sense of it. Even if you can read it in a relational table, you won there. Beyond that, it's just like, okay, I can change the format, I can move it to different. So I think how you ingest it, how do you read that data, how do you actually power your internal tooling to ingest it going from your real world application? That's where actually the modeling and the struggle happens. Like, do you throw an event? Do you bring it into a data warehouse? Do you ingest it and convert it to a different type? That's all up to you. That you have to build that particular muscle in the company that generates that meaning out of the freeform text that you get. So I think it takes some effort to just sort of render that data in a right way, but not necessarily formatted, but essentially giving that a little bit more meaning and giving it more context, I think, is a better word to say that, okay, this comes from this particular application. It comes from some more of the metadata getting associated with that. And then you say, okay, now I have the full picture. This is what the context of that text is. And then let me model it into a format that will more make sense for my use cases. So I think it's a journey that takes input, and then how do you ingest it? How do you make sense of it beyond what the customer or someone entered, and how you make sense of it down the line for your analysts, for your data scientists, whoever is your customer internally.
Interesting. What books are you reading right now?
I was reading Deep Work by Cal Newport. I guess started it 2 days ago, I think. More like focused and like sort of, I'm kind of dealing with that kind of like too many things of distracting. Like, okay, I want to learn Rust. I want to learn everything in in the data world that makes sense. I want to learn AI. There's a lot of like distractions in that case of my mind to learn different things. So I'm trying to like focus. I don't know if this book will help. I hope it does, but self-help books are generally like very subjective. They would work for somebody, they would not. But I'm giving it a shot and seeing if it actually makes sense.
It's a good book.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Have
It's
you read
good.
it?
I did. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's good in the sense where I feel like, well, like a lot of self-help books, it tells you nothing that you didn't already know about your situation, but it's just it's it's like talking to a good friend, and maybe your friend giving you advice that you should listen to, but somehow you don't. So
reflecting back your own advice, basically. Like you tell them what you should be doing, they're like, yeah, do that.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned deep work. I'm reading a book right now called 4,000 Weeks. It's another book on time management. And it's kind of morbid because it's like, you have 4,000 weeks on average to live and so forth. So, and the essence of this book is just procrastinate everything. Just drop the ball on like nearly everything in your life and just focus on the one or two things that are actually like really critical to you. So it's.
I'm trying this experiment over the past, since I moved to a different team internally. I have been trying to do this one experiment of having a weekly Notion doc of the things that I am working on. And I've sort of been rearranging those things as the priority shifts within the week. Like if something comes in, it'll go in first. And then maybe towards the end of the day, I realign it to saying, oh, this is actually more important to get done by the end of the week versus this other thing. So I deprioritize and prioritize. It's basically just moving within a to-do list. So, but I've been doing that for 4 weeks now, and it's been somewhat helpful in my mind to just dump it out there and be mindful of like, okay, I have these things to do versus trying to remember and forgetting. And it's happened in the past, like I've lost track of things and like, okay, wait, I missed out on this thing, so I'm working on a Saturday fixing this for Monday. So that's one sort of hack I'm trying to.
That's really cool.
Well, it's not even so much forgetting sometimes, is that if you don't turn it into a concrete thing, you will get distracted. Like there are always, 1,000 different priorities coming your way. And so the things that are really important in your life tend to fall to the bottom of that list because they don't necessarily scream loudly at you. It's like the, fix for a bug, customer critical bug. Obviously that's something that you have to get done, but you just tend to forget the big life goals when you're dealing with those day-to-day problems.
Well, and addressing all these small things too, there's a paradox where it actually might introduce more work for you. Like replying to emails and stuff. So yeah, it's fascinating. I think this is definitely a conversation I think, Matt, we should have on the show. Maybe Neelesh can join us back for just a time management or a work hacks show, because it's one of these things. I feel like everybody in our field, well, everybody in most fields really, it feels this constant. Have you heard of the Red Queen effect? So it's from Alice in Wonderland, and basically, you're running faster and faster just to stay in the same place.
Interesting.
But that feels a lot like most people's days. So.
The other sort of simple thing is I'm sitting at my desk. I use like index cards, like just lined index cards to write it down. And like, okay, I'm just like, okay, I'm going to do these 4 things.
That's cool.
Try to Pomodoro things like, okay, I'll do it in 25-minute increments. It doesn't end up happening, but I just stretch it for an hour or something. So.
Yeah, what's the Pomodoro supposed to be like? 25 minutes, the break, and then
5-minute break.
Yeah, because I'm looking at my Pomodoro timer on my computer right now. So
oh yeah. I think I have one that I don't use. Yeah, I bought the app and I don't use it. So
yeah it's just just everyone. Yes, please, time management skills. Yep. This is I think it's interesting. This is like the unspoken struggle of our age. So it's I'm sure it could. You could set an entire podcast on nothing but time management. I'm sure it would just be like everyone would love to spend their time listening to your podcast instead of getting shit done. So,
well, it's just subjective. It works differently for different people. So,
yeah, that's just it. Yeah, like for me, unless I, so I basically only take meetings on Mondays and part of Tuesdays now. My schedule is and my lifestyle is such that I can do that. A lot of people can't, but so I want to reserve, many days just for things like reading and writing and thinking and like the deep work. Really, you're studying, right? It's like you do have to set aside time for that. If you're getting constantly bombarded from every angle, like you just don't have the mental capacity to focus on anything. And so, for me personally, I'm trying to like get rid of most distractions, and not add more complexity. So
it's hard. I will tell you that, because unless you forcefully add calendar blocks or focus times, you're not going to get your time back. You have to be very mindful of that. And what I do is I try to keep, at least in our team, we have this practice of keeping Tuesdays and Fridays open, like no meetings, and like, so it's more like focused work. So today, like I have meetings till 1 p.m. from like 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. So I barely get a lot of done on Mondays, and that's fine. Like I do some towards the end of the day, but I keep most of my work for Tuesdays and Fridays, and the rest are just meetings scattered over.
That's cool, though.
Some random things.
Do you feel like you have a sense of predictability to your week then?
Somewhat, but it depends on, the burning items that come up on Tuesday. So I have to like add more time on Tuesdays, or it depends on the week in general. So otherwise it's not always smooth sailing, but like I do get my Fridays consistently back. So that's really helpful. And it's been like, okay, no distractions. Let me just code or write docs or whatever. So so Fridays are pretty much open, but any other day of the week, it's somewhat unpredictable at this point of time. Since I'm kind of learning as well. Like I joined a new team, but I'm like ramping up myself and sort of being mindful of the priorities of the team. So there's learning time plus doing work time. So I have to be sort of very split brain on both of those things. And it's really, that's the struggle I'm going through right now. So just like making sure I'm being mindful for both those priorities.
Sure. Yeah, I think you'll get a lot out of deep work. It's an excellent book.
I'm looking forward to it. I just started it.
That's cool. Awesome. Thanks for being on the show. Hope you're back on sometime. We can talk about time management or something. But for people who want to learn more about you, how can they find you?
LinkedIn is the best place. I think I have
Okay.
all the other links from there. I'm on Twitter, but mostly it's like data, random tweeting stuff, but like more meaningful content. I come out with LinkedIn and my Substack called Hysterical. So
It's a good Substack.
yeah, that's
We should
where right. I have to be more consistent, but I've written a lot over the last year, but I've still start for this year's.
Yeah. I think I came across. I came across you. I think it was in a Chad Sanderson Slack group or also on LinkedIn. But we had some good conversations there. And then I read your Substack. And I was like, this is one of the better data Substacks I've seen. So just you think really well about the space and in a very clear fashion, which means you probably think really clearly about the problem. So that's cool. Thanks for being on the show. Let me see. Events this week, Matt? Is anything going on this week?
Did you say we had a chat coming up on Friday, or maybe we're not ready to announce that yet? We can post that on LinkedIn when we're certain about it, right?
Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
I think I'm supposed to do an AMA with Kensu on Thursday, and then Data for Breakfast. If you're in Salt Lake City on Wednesday, March 1st, come to Snowflake's Data for Breakfast. You can talk data and get breakfast. It's amazing. I know. It's just exactly as it sounds. Chris Tabb will be there, the legendary Brit, who's now more stateside, so he'll be there. On the 15th of March, DBT is sponsoring a meetup in Salt Lake City. So Utah Data Engineering Meetup and the DBT Meetup will be kind of teaming up on this one. So that'll be a lot of fun. Then I will be, let me see, 21st, I'll be giving a talk in Paris. I won't tell you where or much more about it. I expect details imminently. So it should be a lot of fun. So, and then I'll be in Switzerland for SCID. So if anyone's there, Chris Tabb's thing over in Switzerland, come hang out. So it'll be a lot of fun. Awesome. Next week we have Roger Virtual as well. He'll be on the show. So Roger, he is one of the smartest people I've seen in data. So it's gonna be a really fun show. So awesome. Well, thanks, Neelesh. I know you got to get on with your day, so we'll talk soon. Thanks to the audience. Great questions, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
See you guys. Thanks for having me. Bye.
Thanks.